Picture this. It's 336 BCE in ancient Corinth. The most powerful man in the world, Alexander the Great, conqueror of nations, ruler of the known world, approaches a homeless man lying naked in a barrel under the scorching Mediterranean sun. This isn't just any homeless man. This is Diogenes of Sinope, the philosopher they called the dog. Alexander, surrounded by his glittering entourage of generals and courtiers, looks down at this strange figure and says, "I am Alexander the Great. Ask me for anything you desire, and I shall grant it." Without even looking up, Diogenes replies, "Yes, you can do something for me. Move out of my sunlight." The most powerful ruler on earth, dismissed like a common street vendor blocking someone's view. But here's the incredible part: Alexander wasn't offended. In fact, he was so impressed that he reportedly said, "If I were not Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes. Welcome to one of history's most fascinating and outrageous stories. The tale of a man who rejected every social convention, lived like an animal, and yet influenced some of the greatest minds in human history." This is the story of Diogenes the Cynic, the philosopher who proved that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. But before we dive into that legendary encounter with Alexander, we need to understand how a respectable citizen from a wealthy family ended up living in a barrel and being called a dog by his contemporaries. Our story begins around 412 BCE in Sinope, a prosperous Greek colony on the southern coast of the Black Sea in what is now Turkey. Sinope was known for its wealth, its strategic location on major trade routes, and its production of a highly valued red dye called cinnabar. It was here that Diogenes was born into privilege. His father, Hicesias, was a prominent banker and money changer who held the prestigious position of managing the city's currency. Young Diogenes grew up in comfort, receiving the education expected of a wealthy Greek citizen. He learned rhetoric, studied the poets, and was groomed to follow in his father's footsteps in the world of finance and commerce. But fate had other plans. When Diogenes was in his 20s, a scandal erupted that would change the course of his life forever. His father was caught debasing the currency, either adding cheaper metals to coins or reducing their weight while maintaining their face value. In the ancient world, this was considered one of the most serious crimes imaginable, as currency was sacred, often bearing the images of gods and guaranteed by the divine authority of the state. The punishment was severe. Hicesias was exiled, his family's wealth was confiscated, and young Diogenes found himself branded as the son of a criminal, cast out from respectable society. Most people in such circumstances would have tried to rebuild their reputation, perhaps moving to a new city where their family's shame wasn't known. But Diogenes took a radically different path. Instead of seeing his exile and poverty as a catastrophe to be overcome, he began to view it as a liberation. If society had rejected him, he would reject society right back. If he couldn't have wealth and status, he would show the world that these things were worthless anyway. And so began one of the most extraordinary philosophical journeys in human history. Diogenes made his way to Athens, the intellectual heart of the Greek world, arriving with nothing but the clothes on his back. Athens in the 4th century BCE was a city buzzing with philosophical activity. This was the Athens of Plato and his academy, where young men from across the Greek world came to study with the great masters. The agora, or marketplace, was filled with sophists offering to teach rhetoric and wisdom for a fee, while in the gymnasiums and porticos, philosophers debated the nature of reality, ethics, and the good life. It was in this intellectual ferment that Diogenes encountered the philosophy of Antisthenes, a former student of Socrates who had developed a radical approach to ethics and human happiness. Antisthenes taught that virtue was the only true good, that external possessions and social conventions were not just unnecessary but actually harmful to human flourishing. He believed that the path to happiness lay in self-sufficiency, in needing as little as possible from the external world. But while Antisthenes taught these ideas, Diogenes would live them with a literalness and extremity that shocked even his teacher. Legend has it that when Diogenes first approached Antisthenes requesting to become his student, the older philosopher tried to drive him away with his staff, hoping to test the young man's commitment. Diogenes supposedly said, "Strike me if you will, but you will never find a stick hard enough to drive me away from you as long as I think you have something to say." Whether this story is true or not, it captures something essential about Diogenes' character: his absolute determination and his immunity to social pressure or physical discomfort. Under Antisthenes' influence, Diogenes began to develop what would become known as Cynic philosophy, though he took it far beyond anything his teacher had envisioned. The word cynic comes from the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog-like, and Diogenes embraced this label with enthusiasm. If people wanted to call him a dog, he would show them what it really meant to live like one. And so Diogenes began his extraordinary experiment in radical minimalism. He cast off his possessions one by one, keeping only the most basic necessities. He wore a simple cloak that served as both clothing and blanket, carried a staff, and kept a small bag for food. But even these few possessions seemed too much. One day, he saw a child drinking from his cupped hands and threw away his cup, realizing it was unnecessary. Another day, he watched a child eating lentils with a piece of bread and discarded his bowl, seeing that the bread could serve the same purpose. But Diogenes wasn't just reducing his possessions. He was systematically dismantling every social convention that most people considered essential to civilized life. He ate when he was hungry, regardless of social meal times. He slept when he was tired, wherever he happened to be. He relieved himself in public, arguing that if the gods had made these functions natural, there was no reason to be ashamed of them. When people expressed shock at his behavior, he would ask them why they were more concerned with arbitrary social rules than with living according to nature. This brings us to one of the most famous aspects of Diogenes' lifestyle: his home in a barrel, or more accurately, a large ceramic storage jar called a Pithos. These massive containers, some tall enough for a person to stand in, were used throughout the ancient world to store grain, oil, and wine. Diogenes made one of these his permanent residence, rolling it to different locations around Athens depending on his mood and the season. The image of the philosopher living in a barrel became so iconic that it's how most people remember him today. But we need to understand what this choice represented. In a world where social status was largely determined by the size and grandeur of one's home, where wealthy citizens competed to build the most impressive houses and host the most elaborate dinner parties, Diogenes' barrel was a radical statement. He was demonstrating that not only could a human being survive with minimal shelter, but that they might actually be happier without the burden of property ownership. He didn't need to work to pay rent or maintain a house. He didn't need to worry about theft or fire destroying his possessions. He was, in his own strange way, completely free. But Diogenes wasn't content merely to live differently. He was determined to teach through his actions and words. He became a familiar figure in the Athenian agora, where he would engage anyone who would listen in philosophical discussions. His teaching method was unlike any other philosopher of his time. Instead of founding a school or charging fees for instruction, he taught through what we might call guerrilla philosophy: shocking statements, outrageous actions, and piercing questions that forced people to examine their assumptions about life. One of his favorite techniques was what he called debasing the currency, a phrase that deliberately echoed his father's crime but gave it new meaning. Just as his father had reduced the value of coins by mixing them with cheaper metals, Diogenes aimed to reduce the value that people placed on social conventions by exposing their arbitrary nature. When he saw people fussing over proper table manners, he would eat messily with his hands. When he encountered elaborate religious ceremonies, he would point out that the gods, if they existed, probably didn't care about human ritual. When he met people obsessed with their appearance, he would deliberately make himself look as unkempt as possible. His wit was legendary throughout Athens. When someone criticized him for drinking in a tavern, he replied, "I also have my hair cut in a barber shop, but that doesn't make me a barber." When a young man was showing off his expensive clothes, Diogenes commented, "I can see your vanity through the holes in your cloak." When asked why he was called a dog, he said, "I fawn on those who give me anything, I yelp at those who refuse, and I set my teeth in rascals." The comparison to a dog wasn't entirely negative in the context of ancient philosophy. Dogs were admired for their loyalty, their ability to distinguish between friends and enemies, their simple needs, and their lack of pretension. Diogenes cultivated these canine virtues while rejecting what he saw as the artificial complexities of human civilization. He was loyal to his philosophical principles. He could immediately identify phoniness and pretension in others. He needed very little to survive, and he never pretended to be anything other than what he was. This radical honesty extended to his interactions with some of the most important figures of his time. When Plato defined humans as featherless bipeds, Diogenes plucked a chicken and declared, "Behold, Plato's human," forcing the Academy to revise their definition to featherless bipeds with flat nails. This wasn't just a clever joke, it was a serious philosophical point about the dangers of abstract thinking disconnected from concrete reality. Diogenes had a particularly complex relationship with Plato, who represented everything he opposed about contemporary philosophy. Where Plato taught about ideal forms existing in a perfect realm beyond the physical world, Diogenes insisted that reality was right here in front of us, accessible to anyone willing to see it clearly. Where Plato founded an exclusive academy for the intellectual elite, Diogenes taught anyone who would listen, regardless of their social status or education. Where Plato surrounded himself with the wealthy and powerful, including the tyrant Dionysios of Syracuse, Diogenes deliberately sought out the company of slaves, prostitutes, and other social outcasts. Their philosophical differences came to a head in various public encounters. When Plato was giving a lecture on his theory of forms, using the example of tableness, the perfect idea of a table that exists beyond any physical table, Diogenes interrupted, "I can see the table, Plato, but I cannot see tableness." Plato replied, "That's because you have eyes to see the table, but you lack the intellectual vision to see tableness." Diogenes shot back, "And you, my friend, have the intellectual vision to see non-existent tableness, but you lack the common sense to see an actual table." This exchange encapsulates the fundamental difference between their approaches to philosophy. Plato sought truth in abstract reasoning and mathematical relationships, believing that the physical world was merely a shadowy reflection of perfect forms. Diogenes insisted that truth was to be found in direct experience and natural living. For him, philosophy wasn't about constructing elaborate theories, but about learning how to live well in the world as it actually exists. But perhaps the most famous story involving Diogenes concerns neither Plato nor any other philosopher, but rather Alexander of Macedon, later known as Alexander the Great. The encounter we described at the beginning of our story has become one of the most quoted anecdotes in all of philosophy, but to understand its full significance, we need to place it in its historical context. By the time Alexander visited Corinth in 336 BCE, he had already been proclaimed king of Macedon following his father Philip's assassination. He was preparing for his legendary campaign against the Persian Empire, and part of his preparation involved securing the loyalty of the Greek city-states. The League of Corinth, a confederation of Greek cities under Macedonian leadership, had just declared Alexander their hegemon or supreme commander in the war against Persia. It was during this political gathering that Alexander decided to meet some of the famous philosophers who were in Corinth at the time. This wasn't unusual. Powerful rulers often sought the company of intellectual celebrities, both for the prestige it brought and for the practical wisdom they might offer. But when Alexander's entourage arrived at the place where Diogenes was sunbathing, they encountered something unprecedented in the young king's experience. Here was a man who showed no signs of recognizing Alexander's status, no indication that he was impressed by royal power, no attempt to curry favor or seek advancement. When the future conqueror of the known world offered to grant any request, Diogenes treated him like nothing more than an inconveniently placed obstacle blocking his sunlight. The sheer audacity of this response, or perhaps its complete honesty, made a profound impression on Alexander. The king's reported reaction, that if he weren't Alexander, he would want to be Diogenes, reveals something fascinating about the psychological burden of power and ambition. Here was a young man destined to conquer vast territories and accumulate unimaginable wealth, yet he recognized something in this homeless philosopher that he himself lacked. Diogenes had achieved a kind of freedom that no amount of political power could provide. Freedom from want, from social pressure, from the endless cycle of desire and acquisition that drove most human behavior. Some historians question whether this encounter ever actually took place, noting that many similar stories were told about Diogenes and various powerful figures. But whether it's historically accurate or not, the story captures something essential about both men and about the tension between worldly power and philosophical wisdom. Alexander would go on to create one of the largest empires in human history before dying at the age of 32, possibly from exhaustion, disease, or poison. Diogenes would continue living in his barrel, owning nothing and asking for nothing, until his death at around age 90. The contrast becomes even more striking when we consider how each man influenced subsequent history. Alexander's empire fragmented almost immediately after his death, and while his conquests spread Greek culture across the known world, his personal philosophy and way of life inspired few imitators. Diogenes, on the other hand, founded a philosophical movement that would influence thinkers for centuries to come. The Stoics, including figures like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, drew heavily on Cynic teachings about virtue and self-sufficiency. Early Christians found in Cynic philosophy a model for rejecting worldly possessions in favor of spiritual wealth. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand Diogenes' lasting influence, we need to explore more of his actual teachings and practices. His philosophy wasn't just about living with minimal possessions. It was a comprehensive approach to human flourishing that challenged virtually every assumption of Greek society. Take, for example, his attitude towards social class and slavery. In a world where slavery was taken for granted as a natural institution, where even enlightened philosophers like Aristotle defended it as necessary for society to function, Diogenes took a radically different stance. He argued that the distinction between slave and free was purely conventional, having no basis in nature or reason. When he was allegedly captured by pirates and sold into slavery himself, he responded to his situation with typical wit and wisdom. At the slave market, When asked what he could do, Diogenes replied, "Command men." When a potential buyer named Xeniades asked how he could command men while being a slave himself, Diogenes answered, "In the same way that a ship's pilot, though employed by the ship's owner, still commands the vessel." Xeniades was so impressed by this response that he bought Diogenes and made him tutor to his children, saying, "A good demon has entered my house." This story, whether literally true or not, illustrates Diogenes' belief that true freedom and authority come from wisdom and self-mastery, not from social position. In his role as tutor to Xeniades' children, he reportedly taught them not just academic subjects but practical skills like swimming, riding, and javelin throwing. More importantly, he taught them to live simply, to value virtue over wealth, and to see through social pretensions. His approach to education was as unconventional as everything else about his philosophy. Instead of teaching students to memorize poetry or master rhetorical techniques that would help them succeed in political life, he focused on practical wisdom and moral development. He believed that most of what passed for education in his time was actually harmful, filling students' heads with useless knowledge while failing to teach them how to live well. When criticized for his unconventional teaching methods, Diogenes would point to the results. His students learned to be self-reliant, to think independently, and to value character over reputation. They were prepared for the real challenges of life, not just for success within the artificial constraints of conventional society. In many ways, his educational philosophy anticipated modern ideas about experiential learning and character development over mere academic achievement. Diogenes' attitude toward marriage and family relationships was equally revolutionary for his time. Greek society was built around the institution of marriage, which served not only to continue family lines, but to cement political and economic alliances between households. Diogenes rejected this entire system, arguing that marriage was often based on property considerations rather than genuine affection, and that the nuclear family could actually hinder human development by creating narrow loyalties that prevented people from caring about humanity as a whole. Instead, he advocated for what he called community of wives and children, not because he was promiscuous or irresponsible, but because he believed that artificial family boundaries prevented people from recognizing their fundamental kinship with all humanity. When asked about his own family background, he would say, "I am a citizen of the world," coining the term cosmopolitan that we still use today. This cosmopolitan vision was perhaps Diogenes' most forward-looking idea. At a time when Greek identity was defined by belonging to a particular city-state, when foreigners were automatically viewed with suspicion, and when most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, Diogenes proclaimed himself a citizen of the cosmos itself. He recognized no artificial boundaries between peoples, no arbitrary distinctions between Greek and barbarian, no loyalty to any particular government or ruler. His cosmopolitanism wasn't abstract or theoretical, it was deeply practical. He demonstrated care and concern for anyone he encountered, regardless of their nationality, social status, or background. When he saw suffering, he responded with compassion. When he encountered injustice, he spoke out against it. When he met people trapped by social conventions that prevented them from living freely, he tried to help them see alternatives. This brings us to another crucial aspect of Diogenes' philosophy, his approach to religion and the gods. The Greece of his time was deeply religious, with elaborate public ceremonies, expensive temple offerings, and complex mythologies about the interventions of gods in human affairs. Diogenes cut through all of this with characteristic directness. When asked if he believed in the gods, he replied, "How can I help believing in them when I see a God-forsaken wretch like you? His attitude toward religion was neither atheistic nor conventionally pious, but rather practical and ethical. He wasn't concerned with complex theological questions about the nature of divinity or the proper forms of worship. Instead, he focused on how religious beliefs affected human behavior. If believing in the gods made people more virtuous, generous, and wise, he supported it. If religious practices became ends in themselves, divorced from moral improvement, he criticized them mercilessly. He was particularly critical of the widespread practice of making expensive offerings to the gods while ignoring the needs of suffering human beings. When he saw people contributing large sums to temple construction while stepping over beggars on the street, he would point out the contradiction. "You honor the gods with gold and marble," he might say, while dishonoring them by ignoring their children who sleep in doorways. This practical approach to religion extended to his views on death and the afterlife. While most of his contemporaries worried constantly about proper burial rites and the fate of their souls after death, Diogenes approached these questions with typical humor and rationality. When asked how he wanted to be buried, he said, "Face down, so that when the world turns upside down, I'll be right side up." When pressed about whether he really wanted his body thrown out unburied, he replied, "Not at all. Just place a stick beside me so I can drive away the wild animals." When someone pointed out that he wouldn't be able to feel anything when dead, he responded, "Exactly. So why should I care what happens to my corpse?" This cavalier attitude toward death wasn't callousness or bravado. It was the logical conclusion of his philosophy. If happiness comes from virtue and wisdom rather than from external circumstances, then even death loses its terror. A person who has learned to live well has nothing to fear from dying. Moreover, excessive concern about death often prevents people from living fully in the present moment. Diogenes' influence on his contemporaries was profound, even when they disagreed with his methods. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, himself a former slave, drew heavily on Cynic teachings about accepting what cannot be changed while working to change what can be improved. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, studied Cynic texts and incorporated many Cynic practices into his own philosophical development. Even Aristotle, who disagreed with many Cynic positions, respected Diogenes' consistency and moral courage. But perhaps the most surprising influence of Cynic philosophy was on early Christianity. Many of the practices and teachings associated with Jesus and his followers, voluntary poverty, rejection of worldly status, care for social outcasts, radical honesty, and cosmopolitan inclusion, had direct parallels in Cynic philosophy. Some scholars have argued that the historical Jesus was influenced by Cynic teachings, though this remains a matter of scholarly debate. What's undeniable is that early Christian writers like John Chrysostom and Jerome saw Cynic philosophers as noble pagans who had anticipated Christian truths through reason and moral insight. They admired the Cynic commitment to voluntary poverty, their indifference to social status, and their willingness to suffer persecution for their beliefs. In many ways, the Christian ideal of the holy fool who speaks truth to power has its roots in the Cynic tradition established by Diogenes. As Diogenes aged, his reputation spread throughout the Greek world. Philosophers, politicians, and ordinary citizens would travel to Athens or Corinth hoping to meet the famous dog and hear his wisdom firsthand. But he never established a formal school or charged fees for instruction. He believed that wisdom couldn't be sold or purchased, only lived and demonstrated. His teaching method remained consistent throughout his life, a combination of provocative questions, shocking actions, and pointed humor designed to force people to examine their assumptions. When a young man complained about the hardships of philosophy, Diogenes handed him a mirror and said, "Look at yourself. Do you think wisdom comes without effort?" When a wealthy merchant boasted about his charitable donations, Diogenes asked, "Which gives you more satisfaction, the good you've done or the praise you've received for it?" These weren't merely clever comebacks, but serious philosophical investigations. Diogenes understood that most people live unexamined lives, following social scripts without ever questioning whether those scripts serve their true interests. His role was to be a gadfly like his predecessor Socrates, stinging people into consciousness and forcing them to think for themselves. But unlike Socrates, who confined his teaching primarily to the educated elite, Diogenes sought out ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, slaves, and foreigners who were normally excluded from philosophical discourse. He believed that wisdom was accessible to everyone, regardless of their education or social background. In fact, he often suggested that simple people had advantages over the highly educated because they hadn't been corrupted by false learning and social pretensions. This democratic approach to philosophy was revolutionary in its time and remains challenging today. It implies that the insights needed for human flourishing aren't hidden in esoteric texts or available only to intellectual specialists, but can be discovered by anyone willing to observe life carefully and think independently. Diogenes demonstrated this by his own example. He had no formal training in philosophy beyond his brief study with Antisthenes, yet he developed one of the most influential philosophical movements in history. The stories about Diogenes' final years vary depending on the source, but they all emphasize his continued commitment to his philosophical principles even as his physical strength declined. Some accounts suggest that he died by holding his breath, choosing the moment of his own death rather than waiting for disease or old age to take him. Others claim that he died from eating raw octopus, either accidentally or as a final gesture of defiance against conventional dietary restrictions. Perhaps the most touching account describes him spending his last years in Corinth, still teaching and still challenging passers-by to examine their lives, but now with the added authority of someone who had consistently lived according to his principles for more than half a century. Visitors would find him sitting in the sun outside his barrel, still wearing his simple cloak, still carrying his staff, still ready with a sharp question or unexpected insight for anyone who approached. When death finally came, probably around 323 BCE, the citizens of Corinth honored him with a monument depicting a dog carved in marble, a tribute that would have amused him greatly. The inscription read, "Time makes even bronze grow old, but your glory, Diogenes, will remain for all eternity. You alone showed mortals the lesson of self-sufficient life and the easiest path to living." But Diogenes' true monument wasn't made of marble. It was the philosophical tradition he established and the countless individuals whose lives were changed by encountering his ideas. The Cynic movement continued for centuries after his death, producing philosophers like Crates of Thebes and his wife Hipparchia, who scandalized society by living together unmarried and practicing philosophy as equals. The influence of Cynic philosophy extended far beyond the ancient world. During the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered Diogenes' writings and stories, finding in his radical individualism and rejection of authority a model for their own challenges to medieval orthodoxy. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau drew on Cynic ideas about natural law and social criticism in developing their critiques of traditional society. In the modern era, Diogenes' philosophy has found new relevance in movements ranging from transcendentalism to environmentalism to voluntary simplicity. Henry David Thoreau's experiment at Walden Pond was directly inspired by Cynic ideals about living deliberately with minimal possessions. Mahatma Gandhi incorporated Cynic practices like voluntary poverty and civil disobedience into his campaigns for social justice. Contemporary minimalists and off-grid living enthusiasts often cite Diogenes as an early pioneer of their lifestyle choices. But perhaps more importantly, Diogenes' core insight that happiness comes from virtue and wisdom rather than from external possessions or social status remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Greece. In our current age of environmental crisis, extreme inequality, and social media-driven status competition, his message about the futility of endless acquisition and the importance of authentic living feels remarkably contemporary. Consider how many of the problems that dominated Diogenes' attention persist in our modern world. We still struggle with the relationship between wealth and happiness, often assuming that more possessions will make us more satisfied despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. We still create artificial hierarchies based on arbitrary factors like family background, educational credentials, or material success, then suffer when we find ourselves on the wrong side of these divisions. We still confuse social conventions with moral truths, following rules and customs without examining whether they actually serve human flourishing. Diogenes' response to these perennial human challenges was to conduct what we might call a lifelong experiment in conscious living. By stripping away everything that society told him he needed to be happy, wealth, status, possessions, conventional relationships, comfortable housing, regular employment, he discovered what actually remained essential for a fulfilled life. His conclusion was that very little external support is actually necessary for human happiness, but that developing virtue, wisdom, and authentic relationships with others is absolutely crucial. This doesn't mean that everyone should or could live exactly as Diogenes did. His extreme lifestyle was partly a philosophical demonstration, designed to shock people into recognizing how many of their assumed needs were actually optional desires. Most people need more shelter, more possessions, and more social structure than he used. But his example challenges us to examine our own lives and ask which of our pursuits actually contribute to our well-being and which are merely distractions from what matters most. The encounter between Diogenes and Alexander the Great that opened our story represents more than just a clever anecdote. It symbolizes the eternal tension between two very different approaches to human greatness. Alexander sought to achieve immortality through conquest and empire building, accumulating power and territory on an unprecedented scale. Diogenes sought to achieve freedom through self-mastery and philosophical insight, reducing his dependencies until nothing external could threaten his peace of mind. Both men succeeded in their goals, but in very different ways. Alexander's name is known worldwide more than 2 millennia after his death, and his military achievements remain unmatched in human history. But his empire lasted barely a decade after his death, and his personal life was marked by increasing paranoia, violence, and isolation as he struggled to maintain control over his vast territories. Diogenes, by contrast, died as poor as he had lived, owning nothing but his cloak and leaving no political legacy. Yet his influence on human thought has been deeper and more lasting than that of many rulers. His insights about the nature of freedom, happiness, and authentic living continue to inspire people seeking alternatives to conventional definitions of success. The story of Diogenes reminds us that there are many different ways to live a significant life. Not everyone needs to conquer nations or accumulate vast wealth to make a meaningful contribution to human understanding. Sometimes the most profound insights come from those who step outside conventional social structures entirely and observe human behavior from a fresh perspective. In our current historical moment, as we face unprecedented challenges from climate change, technological disruption, and social inequality, Diogenes' example offers both inspiration and practical guidance. His willingness to live with less, his skepticism toward status hierarchies, and his commitment to treating all human beings with equal dignity provide a model for building more sustainable and equitable communities. Moreover, his integration of philosophy with daily practice reminds us that wisdom isn't just an intellectual exercise, but a way of life that must be embodied and lived. The gap between knowing what we should do and actually doing it, which psychologists call the intention-action gap, was something Diogenes bridged through his radical commitment to consistency between his beliefs and his behavior. Perhaps most importantly, Diogenes demonstrated that individual transformation and social criticism can go hand in hand. By changing how he lived, he challenged others to examine how they lived. By rejecting conventional values, he opened space for alternative approaches to human flourishing. By modeling a different way of being in the world, he proved that such alternatives were possible, not just theoretical. His legacy challenges us to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions about our own lives and societies. What do we truly need to be happy? Which of our possessions and pursuits actually serve our well-being, and which are merely habits or social expectations? How much of our energy goes toward maintaining appearances rather than developing genuine virtue and wisdom? Are we living authentically according to our own values, or are we simply following scripts written by others? These weren't abstract philosophical questions for Diogenes. They were practical challenges that he met with concrete actions every day of his adult life. When he felt hungry, he ate whatever was available without concern for social meal times or fancy presentations. When he felt tired, he slept wherever he was without worrying about proper accommodations. When he encountered injustice or pretension, he spoke out immediately without calculating the social or political consequences. This direct, unmediated relationship with his own experience gave Diogenes a clarity of perception that often eluded more conventional thinkers. While other philosophers constructed elaborate theoretical systems to explain human behavior, he could observe it directly by watching how people responded to his unconventional presence. Their reactions revealed their deepest assumptions, fears, and desires more clearly than any academic analysis ever could. For example, when wealthy Athenians recoiled from his appearance, he learned about their fear of poverty and social decline. When government officials tried to silence his criticisms, he discovered their insecurity about their own legitimacy. When religious authorities objected to his irreverent comments about the gods, he uncovered their anxiety about losing social control. In each case, people's responses to his provocations taught him something valuable about the hidden dynamics of human motivation. This observational approach to philosophy made Diogenes remarkably effective as a teacher, even though he never formally organized his insights into systematic doctrine. Students learned as much from watching how others reacted to him as from his explicit teachings. They saw how social conditioning operated in real time, how artificial many supposedly natural human behaviors really were, and how much freedom was available to anyone willing to step outside conventional expectations. But Diogenes wasn't interested in creating followers who would simply imitate his lifestyle. He wanted to inspire independent thinking and authentic living in whatever form that might take for each individual. When young people asked him for specific rules to follow, he would often redirect their attention back to their own experience and judgment. "What do you actually need?" he might ask. "What brings you genuine satisfaction rather than mere social approval? What would you do differently if you stopped worrying about other people's opinions?" This emphasis on individual discernment rather than obedience to authority was perhaps Diogenes' most radical contribution to human thought. At a time when most people automatically deferred to tradition, social hierarchy, and religious prescription, he insisted that each person had both the right and the responsibility to think for themselves about how to live well. The implications of this insight extend far beyond personal lifestyle choices into questions of political and social organization. If individuals are capable of moral reasoning and self-direction, as Diogenes believed, then many forms of external authority become questionable. Why should people obey laws that don't serve genuine human welfare? Why should they accept economic systems that create artificial scarcity amid natural abundance? Why should they participate in social hierarchies that elevate some humans above others based on accidents of birth rather than merit or virtue? Diogenes' political philosophy, while never systematically developed, pointed toward what we might call philosophical anarchism, the belief that legitimate authority must be based on wisdom and moral insight rather than force or tradition. He respected no political boundaries, acknowledged no rulers except those who demonstrated genuine virtue, and followed no laws except those that aligned with natural justice and human flourishing. This didn't make him a revolutionary in the conventional sense. He never organized political movements or attempted to overthrow governments through violence. Instead, he practiced what we might call prefigurative politics, living according to his values and demonstrating alternative possibilities through personal example. His life was itself a form of political action, showing that individuals could opt out of systems they found morally objectionable and create more authentic ways of being in community with others. The community that grew up around Diogenes in his later years exemplified this approach to social organization. Followers of Cynic philosophy, including both men and women from various social backgrounds, created informal networks based on mutual aid, philosophical dialogue, and shared commitment to simple living. These communities weren't exclusive or hierarchical like traditional philosophical schools, but remained open to anyone willing to embrace their basic principles. Women played particularly important roles in the Cynic movement, which was unusual for ancient Greek philosophy. Hipparchia of Maronea abandoned a conventional marriage to live with the Cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes, adopting male clothing and engaging in public philosophical debates that scandalized contemporary society. When criticized for her unconventional lifestyle, she reportedly replied, "Do I seem to you to have come to a wrong decision if I devote that time to philosophy which I otherwise would have spent at the loom?" Hipparchia's example illustrates how Diogenes' philosophy opened new possibilities not just for individuals but for entire categories of people who had been excluded from public intellectual life. By insisting that wisdom was accessible to anyone regardless of their social position, he created space for voices that had previously been silenced or marginalized. The practical aspects of Cynic community life were as revolutionary as their philosophical principles. Members shared resources freely, cared for each other during illness and old age, and made decisions collectively rather than deferring to appointed leaders. They demonstrated that human beings could organize themselves cooperatively without elaborate formal structures or external enforcement mechanisms. These experiments in alternative community building influenced later philosophical movements and religious groups throughout the ancient world. The Stoics adopted many Cynic practices while developing more systematic theoretical frameworks. Early Christian communities incorporated Cynic ideals about voluntary poverty and social equality into their own organizational structures. Even some contemporary intentional communities and eco-villages trace their inspiration back to these ancient experiments in conscious living. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Diogenes' approach to community wasn't any particular organizational model, but rather his demonstration that small groups of committed individuals could create meaningful alternatives to mainstream social arrangements. He proved that it was possible to step outside conventional systems while still maintaining connection and mutual support with like-minded others. This insight remains relevant for contemporary social movements seeking to create positive change in the world. Rather than focusing exclusively on changing existing institutions through political action, movements can also work to create alternative institutions that embody their values directly. Community gardens, worker cooperatives, alternative schools, and sustainable living projects all follow this prefigurative approach to social transformation. The environmental movement, in particular, has found inspiration in Diogenes' example of living lightly on the earth while maintaining physical health and psychological well-being. His demonstration that human beings can thrive with minimal material consumption challenges one of the fundamental assumptions of industrial civilization, that increasing material prosperity is necessary for human progress. Contemporary environmental activists often cite Diogenes when advocating for voluntary simplicity as a response to climate change and ecological destruction. If a substantial portion of humanity adopted even a fraction of his approach to consumption, the environmental benefits would be enormous. Reduced demand for housing, transportation, manufactured goods, and processed food would dramatically decrease carbon emissions and resource extraction, while potentially increasing rather than decreasing human happiness and life satisfaction. But environmental applications of Diogenes' philosophy go beyond individual lifestyle choices to encompass broader questions about the relationship between human communities and natural ecosystems. His insistence on living according to nature rather than artificial social conventions aligns with contemporary ecological thinking about the need to integrate human settlements into rather than imposing them upon natural systems. When Diogenes chose to sleep outdoors, eat simple foods, and eliminate unnecessary possessions, he wasn't just making personal choices, but exploring alternative models of human-environment relationship. His lifestyle demonstrated that humans could live as integral parts of rather than separate from the natural world, meeting their needs without dominating or destroying the ecological systems that support all life. This ecological dimension of Cynic philosophy becomes even more significant when we consider its implications for global justice and economic inequality. The lifestyle that Diogenes modeled: materially simple but intellectually rich, socially connected but not status-driven, physically healthy but not luxury-dependent, could potentially be adopted by everyone on the planet without exceeding ecological limits. In contrast, the high-consumption lifestyle pursued by wealthy populations in developed countries could never be universalized without catastrophic environmental consequences. The mathematics of planetary boundaries make it clear that genuine sustainability requires dramatic reductions in material consumption among the world's most affluent populations, precisely the kind of voluntary simplicity that Diogenes pioneered over 2 millennia ago. This convergence between ancient philosophical wisdom and contemporary ecological necessity suggests that Diogenes' insights may be even more relevant today than they were in his own time. What seemed like eccentric personal choices in the context of ancient Greece now appear as prescient explorations of the lifestyle changes that may be necessary for human civilization to survive and thrive on a finite planet. The psychological aspects of Diogenes' philosophy also resonate strongly with contemporary research on happiness and well-being. Studies consistently show that beyond meeting basic needs for food, shelter, and security, additional material consumption contributes very little to life satisfaction. Instead, the factors that most strongly predict happiness include meaningful relationships, engaging work, physical health, and a sense of purpose, exactly the elements that Diogenes cultivated through his philosophical practice. His rejection of status competition anticipates contemporary research on the negative psychological effects of social comparison and materialism. When people base their self-worth on external markers like wealth, appearance, or social position, they become vulnerable to anxiety, depression, and chronic dissatisfaction because these markers are inherently relative and unstable. Diogenes avoided these psychological traps by developing what psychologists now call intrinsic motivation, pursuing activities for their inherent satisfaction rather than for external rewards or recognition. His philosophical investigations, his teaching relationships, and his daily practices of self-sufficiency all exemplified this intrinsically motivated approach to living. The mindfulness and contemplative traditions that have become increasingly popular in Western psychology also find precedent in Diogenes' approach to consciousness and attention. His practice of living in the present moment, accepting what couldn't be changed while working skillfully with what could be influenced, and maintaining equanimity in the face of external circumstances parallels many elements of Buddhist and other contemplative methodologies. But unlike purely individual approaches to psychological well-being, Diogenes' philosophy always maintained a social and ethical dimension. He understood that personal liberation and social transformation were interconnected, that individuals couldn't be truly free while living in unjust social systems, and that social justice couldn't be achieved without individuals taking responsibility for their own consciousness and behavior. This integration of personal and political transformation makes Diogenes' philosophy particularly relevant for contemporary social movements that seek to address both individual suffering and systemic oppression. Rather than choosing between inner work and outer action, his example suggests that the most effective approach involves pursuing both simultaneously. When activists working for social justice also engage in practices that develop their own wisdom, compassion, and equanimity, they become more effective advocates for change while avoiding the burnout and cynicism that often plague social movements. When individuals pursuing personal growth also engage with questions of social justice and ecological sustainability, their spiritual development becomes grounded in real-world service rather than remaining abstract or self-absorbed. The integration of wisdom traditions with social action that Diogenes pioneered has influenced numerous contemporary figures who combine contemplative practice with engagement in social and environmental issues. Thinkers like Thich Nhat Hanh, Suluk Sivaraksa, and Vandana Shiva all exemplify this approach of bringing spiritual insight to bear on practical challenges facing human communities and natural ecosystems. Educational institutions have also found inspiration in Diogenes' approach to learning and teaching. His emphasis on experiential learning, critical thinking, and character development over mere information transmission anticipates many elements of progressive education theory. Contemporary alternative schools, democratic schools, and place-based education programs often embody Cynic principles, even when they don't explicitly reference ancient philosophy. The questioning attitude that Diogenes brought to all forms of received authority also aligns with contemporary emphasis on media literacy, critical thinking skills, and independent research capabilities. In an age of information overload and deliberate misinformation, his example of examining all claims against direct experience and logical reasoning becomes increasingly valuable. But perhaps the most important contemporary application of Diogenes' philosophy lies in its potential to inspire individual courage and authenticity in the face of social pressure to conform. In our current era of social media surveillance, economic insecurity, and political polarization, the pressure to present carefully curated versions of ourselves while suppressing our authentic thoughts and feelings has never been more intense. Diogenes' example of radical honesty, speaking truth regardless of social consequences, living according to his actual values rather than external expectations, and maintaining dignity even when marginalized or ridiculed, provides a powerful model for contemporary authenticity. His life demonstrates that it's possible to maintain integrity and self-respect even when others misunderstand or disapprove of our choices. This doesn't mean that everyone should adopt his specific lifestyle or express themselves in equally provocative ways. Context matters, and what works for one person or community may not be appropriate for another. But his underlying commitment to truth-telling, his refusal to sacrifice inner wisdom for outer approval, and his confidence that authentic living ultimately serves not just individual well-being but collective flourishing remain profoundly relevant. The courage that Diogenes displayed in living according to his convictions despite social opposition is particularly needed today as communities struggle with questions about how to respond to climate change, inequality, technological disruption, and other complex challenges that require fundamental changes in how we organize our societies. Individual actions alone cannot solve these systemic problems, but systemic change is unlikely without individuals who are willing to model alternative possibilities and speak truth about current realities. Diogenes' example suggests that such individual courage and systemic transformation can reinforce each other in positive feedback loops that create momentum for broader social change. As our story draws to a close, we return to the image that opened our exploration. Diogenes lying in the sun, unimpressed by the most powerful ruler of his age, asking only for the simple freedom to enjoy the natural warmth that costs nothing and belongs to everyone. In that moment, he embodied everything his philosophy represented. The recognition that true wealth lies in needing little, that genuine power comes from self-mastery rather than domination of others, and that the deepest wisdom often emerges from the most unexpected places. Alexander the Great conquered the known world but died young, isolated and possibly poisoned by those closest to him. His empire fragmented immediately after his death, leaving behind more questions than answers about the relationship between power and human flourishing. Diogenes the dog owned nothing, commanded no armies, and left no monuments, yet his influence on human thought continues to grow more than 2 millennia after his death. The contrast between their legacies reminds us that there are many different ways to measure significance and success. If we evaluate lives solely by their accumulation of wealth, power, and status, Alexander clearly achieved more than Diogenes. But if we consider contributions to human wisdom, modeling of sustainable lifestyles, and inspiring authentic living, the homeless philosopher emerges as the greater teacher. Perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from Diogenes' extraordinary life is that each of us has the capacity to live with greater authenticity, wisdom, and freedom than we might initially imagine. The barriers to authentic living are often more psychological and social than material, more about our own fears and the expectations of others than about actual practical constraints. By questioning our assumptions about what we truly need to be happy, by examining which of our pursuits actually serve our deepest values, and by having the courage to live according to our own best understanding rather than external pressure, we can all move in the direction that Diogenes pioneered. We may not choose to live in barrels or give away all our possessions, but we can adopt his spirit of conscious living and commitment to truth. In our current historical moment, as humanity faces unprecedented challenges that require both individual transformation and collective action, the example of Diogenes offers both inspiration and practical guidance. He showed us that it's possible to live simply yet richly, to be marginalized yet influential, to own nothing yet possess everything that truly matters. Most importantly, he demonstrated that philosophical wisdom isn't an abstract intellectual exercise but a way of life that can be embodied and lived by anyone willing to examine their assumptions, embrace discomfort in service of growth, and maintain faith in the possibility of human flourishing, even in the face of social opposition or material hardship. The man who told Alexander the Great to move out of his sunlight continues to illuminate paths toward freedom for anyone willing to step outside conventional shadows and discover what becomes possible when we stop letting others define the boundaries of our lives. In a world that often seems to offer only the choice between conformity and isolation, Diogenes points toward a third option: the path of conscious nonconformity that serves not just individual liberation but collective transformation. His barrel may have been small, but the vision it sheltered was large enough to encompass all humanity. His possessions may have been few, but his legacy is immeasurable. And his life, however strange it might have appeared to his contemporaries, ultimately proved that the greatest wealth lies not in what we can accumulate, but in what we can learn to do without while still maintaining joy, dignity, and connection with the world around us. That, perhaps, is the final wisdom of Diogenes the dog, that in learning to need less, we discover that we are capable of so much more than we ever imagined possible. And in that discovery lies both the path to personal freedom and the foundation for building communities and societies that serve human flourishing rather than merely human accumulation. The sun that Diogenes asked Alexander to stop blocking continues to shine freely for all who choose to step into its light. The only question that remains is whether we have the wisdom and courage to recognize its warmth and the simplicity to enjoy it without trying to own or control it. In answering that question for ourselves, we continue the philosophical experiment that Diogenes began more than 2,000 years ago, the experiment of discovering what it means to be truly human in a world that often seems designed to make us forget. If this journey through ancient wisdom resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating thinkers. And in the comments below, let me know what time it is where you are right now and what part of the world you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers across the globe who share a passion for timeless philosophy.